The first thing I noticed when I walked into my daughter Emily's room was the silence. No music playing, no typing at her desk, none of the usual sounds of a busy 17-year-old preparing college applications. Just silence and the sight of my daughter curled up on her bed, shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. "Emily?" I said softly, my heart dropping. "What happened?" She looked up at me, her face streaked with tears, clutching a letter in her trembling hands. They rejected me," she managed between sobs. "Stanford said. They said they had to rescind my early acceptance due to academic dishonesty." My blood ran cold. Academic dishonesty? Emily? The girl who had spent the last 4 years maintaining a perfect GPA while juggling varsity swimming, student government, and countless volunteer hours? "That's impossible," I said, sitting on the edge of her bed. "There must be some mistake." Emily handed me the letter, her hands shaking. "Someone reported that I cheated on my AP chemistry finals. They said they had proof." As I scanned the formal language of the rejection letter, my mind was already racing. Emily had been dreaming of Stanford since she was 12. Her room was decorated in cardinal red and white, Stanford pennants hanging on every wall. She had earned this, really earned it, and now someone was trying to take it away from her. Who would do this? I wondered aloud, but even as the words left my mouth, I knew. The slight smile I'd seen on Grace's face at breakfast this morning suddenly made horrible sense. Grace, my stepdaughter. The girl who had made it her mission to compete with Emily ever since her father and I married 3 years ago. "My name is Catherine Mitchell," and at that moment, watching my daughter's dreams crumble because of what I strongly suspected was her stepsister's jealousy, I felt something inside me shift. The careful peace I maintained in our blended family, always trying to keep everyone happy, suddenly seemed less important than justice. "Mom?" Emily's voice was small, younger somehow. "What am I going to do?" Stanford it was everything. I pulled her close, letting her cry into my shoulder while my mind worked furiously. "We're going to fight this," I said firmly. "Whatever it takes." What Emily didn't know, what no one in our family really knew, was that before I became Catherine Mitchell, devoted wife and mother, I had been Catherine Reynolds, investigative journalist. I had spent 15 years uncovering truths that people tried to hide, following paper trails and exposing lies. I had stepped away from that life when I married David, choosing instead to focus on our blended family. But those skills, they never really go away. "I need you to tell me exactly what happened," I said, pulling back to look at Emily. Every detail. Through her tears, Emily explained. The accusation claimed she had cheated on her AP chemistry final last semester, the same class where she had finally pulled ahead of Grace in rankings. Apparently, someone had provided the school with evidence that Emily had accessed test materials beforehand. "But I didn't," she insisted, fresh tears spilling. "I studied for weeks. I did. I did know. I had watched her spend countless nights at her desk, chemical equations spread around her like a complicated puzzle. Emily had earned her A+ honestly, the same A+ that had pushed her class ranking just above Grace's. Grace got her Stanford rejection last week," Emily said quietly, realization dawning in her eyes. She was so angry. "Don't worry about Grace right now," I said, though internally my suspicions were hardening into certainty. "Just tell me everything you remember about the test day." As Emily recounted the details, I made mental notes. The testing room setup, the seating arrangement, the proctor's position. Every detail could be important. What Grace didn't know, what none of them knew, was that she hadn't just messed with my daughter's future. She had awakened something I had kept dormant for years. The relentless pursuit of truth that had once been my life's work. I waited until Emily had cried herself to sleep before making my first move. In my home office, I pulled out a notebook I hadn't touched in years. The reporter's instincts kicked in as I began mapping out what I knew and what I needed to find out. First step, the evidence itself. What exactly had been provided to the school? And more importantly, how had it been obtained? I opened my laptop and typed out a carefully worded email to Stanford's admissions office, requesting copies of all materials related to the academic dishonesty claim. Then I sent another to Emily's high school principal, scheduling an urgent meeting. As I worked, I heard footsteps in the hallway, Grace's distinctive gait. She paused briefly near my office door, probably wondering why the light was still on at midnight. I kept typing. giving no indication that I had noticed her presence. Let her think she had won. Let her believe that her perfect plan had worked. Because what Grace didn't understand was that she had just made a crucial mistake. She had hurt my daughter, yes, but more than that, she had left a trail. And following trails, that was what I did best. The next morning, I maintained my normal routine, made breakfast, packed lunches, smiled at David and Grace as they left for their days. But as soon as they were gone, I began my real work. First stop, Emily's high school. Principal Martinez was waiting for me, looking uncomfortable as I took a seat across from his desk. "Mrs. Mitchell," he began, "I understand you're upset, but the evidence—" "Show me," I interrupted calmly. "Show me exactly what evidence was presented to Stanford." He hesitated, then pulled out a file. Inside were screenshots of what appeared to be text messages between Emily and another student discussing test answers. There were also photographs of what looked like test materials on Emily's desk before the exam. I studied them carefully, my old training kicking in. "These are very convenient," I said finally. "Almost too convenient. Tell me, did anyone verify the authenticity of these messages? Check the metadata on the photos." Principal Martinez shifted in his seat. "Well, given the serious nature of the accusation, I'll take that as a no." I closed the file. "I'd like copies of everything, please, and I'll need the name of the student who provided these." I can't reveal that information." I smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You can, and you will. Because if you don't, the next person sitting in this chair will be my lawyer, asking why the school acted on unverified evidence without due process." 20 minutes later, I walked out with everything I needed, including the confirmation that Grace had been the one to report Emily. Phase 1 complete. Now for the real work to begin. The more I dug into Grace's evidence, the more threads began to unravel. Sitting at my desk late that night, surrounded by printouts and digital forensics reports, I felt a familiar surge of satisfaction. The kind I used to get when a big story was coming together. The text messages Grace had submitted, they were fake, good fakes, but fake nonetheless. My old contact in digital forensics had confirmed it. The metadata didn't match up, and the timestamps had been manipulated. The photos of test materials on Emily's desk, taken weeks after the actual exam, carefully staged to look incriminating. Grace had been thorough, I'd give her that. But she hadn't counted on going up against someone who had spent years exposing frauds far more sophisticated than this. My phone buzzed, a text from David. "Working late again. Don't wait up." I smiled grimly. My husband had no idea what his daughter had done, or what I was doing to fix it. He saw Grace as his perfect little girl, incapable of such calculated cruelty. Just like he didn't really know about my past life as an investigative journalist. Our marriage had been built on fresh starts, on leaving the past behind. But some things couldn't be left behind. "Mom?" Emily appeared in my doorway, looking small in her oversized Stanford sweatshirt. "What are you doing up so late?" I quickly minimized the screens on my laptop. "Just some work, honey. How are you holding up?" She shrugged, but I could see the pain in her eyes. "I submitted applications to other schools, safety schools." She practically whispered the last part, like it physically hurt to say it. "Emily," I said carefully, "I need you to trust me. This isn't over." She looked at me skeptically. "Mom, Stanford already made their decision. Grace won." "Did she?" I pulled out a folder. "Come here. I want to show you something." I laid out the evidence of Grace's deception. The forensics report, the timeline inconsistencies, everything I had gathered over the past week. Emily's eyes widened as she took it all in. She really did this? Her voice trembled. "But why? Why would she go to all this trouble?" "Because she couldn't beat you fairly," I said simply, and she underestimated who she was dealing with. Emily looked up at me, really looked at me, like she was seeing something new. "Mom, how did you figure all this out?" I took a deep breath. It was time for some truth. Before I married your stepdad, before I became just mom, I was an investigative journalist. I specialized in exposing frauds and cover-ups. I smiled at her shocked expression. Let's just say Grace picked the wrong person to try to deceive. Just then, we heard the front door open, David and Grace returning from their late dinner. Emily quickly helped me gather the papers, understanding instinctively that this needed to stay between us for now. "Trust me," I whispered as she headed back to her room. She nodded, and for the first time in weeks, I saw a glimmer of hope in her eyes. The next morning, Grace was her usual sweet self at breakfast, playing the concerned stepsister perfectly. "Emily, I heard back from UCLA yesterday. Their psychology program is really good too, you know." I watched Emily's hands clench under the table but admired her composure as she forced a smile. "Thanks, Grace. I'll keep that in mind." David beamed at Grace. "Always looking out for others, aren't you, sweetheart?" I took a slow sip of coffee, remembering the latest piece of evidence I had uncovered last night. Grace's secret email account, the one she'd used to submit the false claims to Stanford. She'd been clever, using a VPN to hide her tracks, but not quite clever enough. After they left for school, I made my move. First stop, Stanford's Office of Academic Integrity. I had an appointment with the dean, and this time, I was armed with more than just maternal indignation. Dean Harrison was a stern-looking woman with steel gray hair and sharp eyes. She didn't look like someone easily swayed by emotion. "Perfect. Mrs. Mitchell," she began, "while I understand your distress." I cut her off by placing a thick folder on her desk. "With respect, Dean Harrison, you don't understand anything yet, but you're about to." For the next hour, I laid out the evidence. The forensic analysis proving the text messages were fabricated. The metadata showing the photos were taken after the exam. The email trail linking everything back to Grace's secret account. This, I concluded, is not just about my daughter's college acceptance. This is about a deliberate attempt to destroy someone's academic future through fraudulent means. The question is, what are you going to do about it? Dean Harrison was silent for a long moment, reviewing the documents with growing concern. Finally, she looked up at me. "This is quite comprehensive, Mrs. Mitchell. May I ask how you obtained all this?" "Let's just say I have experience in uncovering the truth." I met her gaze steadily. "The question is, does Stanford have the integrity to admit they acted on false information?" She nodded slowly. "We'll need to verify everything independently, of course. But if this all checks out," she trailed off, then straightened in her chair, "we may need to reconsider our decision regarding your daughter's admission." As I left her office, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. Phase 2 was complete, but the hardest part was still to come. Because Grace, she still thought she had won. She had no idea that her carefully constructed plan was about to come crashing down around her. And I had decided that the revelation would happen in the most public way possible, at her high school graduation, where she was scheduled to give a speech as salutatorian. Right after Emily would speak as valedictorian. That is, if everything went according to my plan. Graduation day dawned bright and clear. I sat in the school auditorium between David and Grace's mother, Janet, who had flown in for the occasion. The proud parents watching their children graduate. If they only knew what was coming. Grace was practically glowing in her white graduation robe, chatting with friends near the stage. Emily sat quietly in her valedictorian's chair, her face composed but her hands fidgeting with the envelope containing her speech. What neither of them knew was that I had a third envelope tucked safely in my purse. "Can you believe both our girls did so well?" Janet whispered to me. "Grace was so disappointed about Stanford, but she's handled it with such grace. UCLA will be lucky to have her." I smiled politely, thinking about the email I'd received from Stanford yesterday confirming everything was in place. Yes, they've both handled everything exactly as expected. The ceremony began with the usual speeches, the principal, the school board president, various dignitaries. Finally, it was time for the student speeches. Emily stood first, walking to the podium with quiet confidence. Her voice was clear and strong as she began. "When I was little, my mom taught me that truth always finds its way to the light, that no matter how deep someone tries to bury it, the truth has a way of surfacing when it matters most." My heart swelled with pride. We had worked on this speech together, carefully crafting each word. This year, I learned that lesson firsthand. I learned that sometimes people will try to take what's yours, will try to dim your light to make theirs shine brighter. But I also learned that if you stay true to yourself, if you keep working and believing in what's right, justice has a way of prevailing. I saw Grace shift uncomfortably in her seat. Emily continued, her voice growing stronger. "So today, as we prepare to leave these halls and start our new journeys, I want to share something with all of you. Something that proves that truth and justice aren't just words and inspirational quotes. They're real and they matter. This was my cue. I stood up, drawing confused looks from David and Janet. 2 months ago, Emily said my acceptance to Stanford was rescinded because someone provided false evidence claiming I had cheated. Today, I'm honored to announce that not only has that decision been reversed, but Stanford has offered me a full academic scholarship. The auditorium erupted in applause. Grace's face had gone pale. But wait, Emily held up her hand. There's more to this story. Mom. I walked to the stage, my heels clicking against the wooden floor in the sudden silence. Principal Martinez, who had been briefed about what was coming, nodded slightly. Good morning, I said, taking the podium. My name is Catherine Mitchell, and before I was a mother, I was an investigative journalist specializing in exposing fraud. Today, I'm here to share some evidence that recently came to light. I opened my envelope and began laying out the truth, the fabricated texts, the staged photos, the secret email account. With each revelation, Grace sank lower in her seat. The person who orchestrated this campaign to destroy my daughter's future, I continued, my voice steady, is sitting on this stage right now. The audience gasped. David stood up, his face a mask of confusion and growing horror. Grace, I said, turning to face my stepdaughter directly, would you like to explain why you did it? Grace looked wildly around like a cornered animal. I don't know what you're talking about. You can't prove. Actually, I interrupted, pulling out the final piece of evidence, a printout of emails from her secret account. I can. And I did. What followed was chaos. Grace burst into tears. David demanded explanations. Janet looked like she might faint. But through it all, Emily stood tall, finally vindicated. Principal Martinez took the microphone, his voice cutting through the uproar. In light of this evidence, which has been thoroughly verified, the school board has made some adjustments to today's proceedings. Grace Mitchell, please step down from the stage. Your diploma will be held pending a review of your academic record. As Grace fled the stage, I returned to my seat. David turned to me, his face a mix of anger and betrayal. Why did he tell me? Would you have believed me? I asked quietly. Or would you have defended her, like you always do? He had no answer for that. The ceremony continued, though in a somewhat subdued fashion. Emily gave the rest of her speech, speaking about integrity and second chances. She was gracious, never mentioning Grace by name again. Afterward, as we stood in the parking lot taking pictures, Stanford's formal reinstatement letter safely tucked in Emily's graduation cap, David approached me. I don't know what to say, he began. I had no idea Grace could do something like this. I know, I said simply. That's part of the problem. He nodded slowly. What happens now? Now we deal with the consequences. All of us. I looked at him steadily. Grace needs help, David. Real help. Not excuses or protection. Later that night, as Emily and I sat in our backyard looking at the stars, she asked me the question I've been expecting. Mom, did you have to do it so publicly? Expose Grace like that? I thought carefully before answering. Sometimes, sweetheart, justice needs witnesses. What Grace did wasn't just about hurting you. It was about making everyone believe a lie. The truth needed the same audience. She nodded, understanding. Will things ever be the same with David? No, I said honestly. But maybe that's not a bad thing. Sometimes relationships need to be rebuilt on truth instead of comfortable lies. 3 months later, Emily moved into her dorm at Stanford. Her room was exactly as she dreamed it would be, decorated in cardinal red and white. Grace had started therapy, finally confronting the jealousy and insecurity that had driven her actions. David and I were in counseling, working to rebuild our marriage on a foundation of honesty. As for me, I discovered that my old investigative skills hadn't faded. They'd just been waiting for the right moment to resurface. I'd started taking on some freelance work, exposing truths that needed to be told. Sometimes the biggest stories aren't about international conspiracies or corporate fraud. Sometimes they're about the quiet battles fought in suburban homes where truth and justice matter just as much as they do anywhere else. And sometimes the most important investigations are the ones that protect not just the truth, but the people we love most.